What's up, gang? Like and share, please. Good to see everybody in here. We'll get started in a second. Shouts out to iPack for that art. Shouts out to Rooks G. This one's called Ice Climb. Yo, what's up? Tonight we're covering All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. This is my 6th Cormac McCarthy analysis. And so far I've covered Blood Meridian, of course, No Country for Old Men, The Passenger, The Crossing, and The Road. And this is, of course, All the Pretty Horses, 1992. This is the first part of the Border trilogy. Of course, we did The Crossing. So if you read the video description, I think that there is something strangely there's something strangely beautiful about the fact that we've covered all those books before this one because those are perfect prerequisites to this book. And actually, All the Pretty Horses is the most straightforward of the Cormac McCarthy books that I've read. Now that includes No Country for Old Men, and No Country for Old Men is written in a cinematic style. This one, it has bits of that, but this one is interesting because it takes over the cowboy adventure novel and sort of turns it. And what I said in the title was in this sort of subtitle to this stream is that this is a kind of postmodern American mythology, but it is and it isn't. And what I mean by that is that the Road and Blood Meridian are this is kind of an anti Blood Meridian in a way. The two kind of are sort of twins, but this is a completely different novel, and it's probably the most positive and most hopeful of the Cormac McCarthy novels that I've read. There was a movie made. I didn't watch the movie, but shouts out to IPAC Arts for that beautiful thumbnail art that he did. And there was a film in like 2000 with Matt Damon, but I didn't want to sort of muddy the stream here with the film, which you know, it's a Billy Bob Thornton film, but we're just going to be talking. This is pure literary analysis. We're getting back to pure literary analysis here, and the Cormac McCarthy and the Don DeLeo streams kind of go hand in hand. But I thought it would be good to get back to this one because it's been a while since we've done McCarthy, and so here's what happened. So I'll just read a quote from the beginning of this because what I'm going to do is take you through my thesis for the novel. First, I'm going to read you just an excerpt from the book, then take you through a thesis, and then take you through the narrative, and then kind of try and deconstruct the book and read you some literary criticism, some critical analysis of the book. And so on page, we're doing high. This is we're getting back to our pure literary analysis high IQ circle here. So this is page 60 of the novel, and he says this is McCarthy right here. He says, in that false blue dawn, the Pleiades seemed to be rising up into the darkness above the world and dragging all the stars away, the great diamond of Orion and Capella and the signature of Cassiopeia, all rising up through the phosphorus dark like a sea net. He lay a long time listening to the others breathing in their sleep while he contemplated the wildness about him, the wildness within. So one thing that's interesting is right away that you notice is the syntax, the verbiage of the novel, and the lack of course, with McCarthy, you get the lack of quotation marks. And that's all to say that we, the reader, are thrown into a story where we are completely at one with John Grady Cole, and who's our protagonist. He's a 16-year-old. He's our protagonist. And so the book really takes us into an interesting place. So what happens basically is we get a guy named John Grady, and he's living on a ranch in Texas, and he finds that the ranch is going to be sold off. Pieces of it are going to be sold off. His dad really can't do anything about this because he's suffering from the effects of World War II. This is like 1948, so this is just into the postmodern period, postmodernism starting with the A-bomb in 1945. But that doesn't really that plays kind of an absent role in the novel, and this is sort of an old world functioning as new world, and we cross over boundaries from the new world into the old world and sort of back and forth, and it's a physical and a metaphysical journey. So John Grady decides to head to Mexico to try and seek adventure and to make his own way. He realizes he's not going to make his way in Texas, and he goes off with his best friend. So it's a buddy story. He goes off with his best friend Rollins, and they head down south across the border, and they've got a couple horses, and as they head across, they eventually run into a kid named Blevins, and this kid is just all trouble from the very first minute they meet him. And he's following them, and he's on this big beautiful horse, and they realize they're being followed. They finally kind of come across him, and John Grady is a kind of pure-hearted and loving protagonist who is also kind of a mediator between Rollins and Blevins. And then later on, he'll be a mediator in terms of his language. He can go back and forth between Spanish and English. He's competent. And we find that we don't really trust this Blevins kid, and he really represents the old West. He represents a kind of, even though that's where the dichotomy lies, and it's ironic that we get these two older characters who are 16, and then we get this younger character who's, he's like not even a teenager yet, and yet he represents the a sort of an old world, really a kind of cowboy novel style, uh, lone figure, an outlaw. And we can't tell if he's stolen the horse or that he's riding or what he did, because he speaks in confusing and simplistic phrases where even the other characters, especially Rollins, they are mystified by what he says, not in a spiritual way, but mystified in terms of, what are you doing? Why are you on this horse, and what are you doing? Well, they end up in a lightning storm, and the horse gets washed away. The kid has a gun. He's a crack shot. He loses his clothes, and they rescue him, and then they have to make their way south until eventually, they find that they have to recover the horse. There's three of them, and they have to recover the horse, and they sort of play into this outlaw scenario where they have to go and steal the horse. And now the problem is that nobody knows whose horse is whose, and so they are kind of they're worried about being seen as horse thieves, even though they're stealing back a horse that's his, but they still don't know if it's his or not. Well, eventually they do that, and there's a shootout, and the kid disappears. And then we're left back with who we were left with at the beginning, who we started with, and that's Rollins and John Grady, who's our hero. And they make their way until they find this gigantic ranch, and they get hired by the guy who owns the ranch, who's this big deal, and he's got a beautiful daughter. And the daughter is 17. She's a year older than John Grady, but she's of a different class. And so again, we get this irony that, he's gone south. He's in old Mexico. Remember we talked about that scene in Young Guns where he's like, "I'm going to old Mexico," and it's like they always got to put the old in front of it. I guess because they're in New Mexico. But anyway, so he falls in love with her, and John Grady and Rollins are supposed to break all these horses, and they're working on the ranch. They're great at physical labor. And of course, at horses, the title has horses there, and the way that the horses work in the book is there's a sort of a dream world that occurs. It's not surrealistic, but there's a world, and then there's a dream world. And John Grady's the way the speaker in the book talks about John Grady is always punctuated with these scenes of overarching nocturnal brilliance or daytime, sort of mystical, grand landscapes. And so we see that he's a character. These guys are characters in the landscape, and it seems huge, but they have free will and they have an agency in this that is a lot different from the other McCarthy books. And then, so then what happens is they basically get picked up at the ranch because the guys that they took the horse back from are looking for them, and they obviously had caught Blevins. So then John Grady and Rollins get transported off to this Mexican jail, and there's a long sequence where they have to survive in the jail, and it's kill or be killed, and it's a terrible sequence where it's a kind of a harrowing of hell. In this is how it functions, and then eventually John Grady has to defend himself, and he kills this other guy, this hitman that's been hired to kill him in the jail. And then he gets bailed out. He knows that he's also mortally wounded, but after 3 days, he rises back to life. He lives. He makes his way back to the ranch. He finds out that the aunt, who is part of the system on this gigantic Mexican ranch, a very wealthy old world, has bailed him out, but with the deal was that she'll bail him out if her niece Alejandra, who he fell in love with, will leave him, and will not talk to him again, because she's worried about the system in Mexico not ever forgiving her, and all she has is her reputation. She's going to be big and important. But John Grady goes after her anyway, and decides he can't leave until he has one more, has some closure with her. He finds her. They spend a few days together, and then she's gone. She goes back, and then John Grady goes back to the ranch. And at this point, he then confronts this Mexican sheriff who has killed Blevins. So what happened along the way was that when they were being transported to the jail, they took Blevins, who had killed one of the guys in the meantime, and they take him off into the woods and they shoot him. They hear a single pistol shot. And so John Grady sort of takes him hostage and goes and rescues all the horses. And eventually he lets him go, and then he heads back into the New World, which is back to Texas, goes back to his ranch, and that's pretty much it, and lives his life. But first he goes and talks to the judge, who we're supposed to think of Judge Holden in Blood Meridian. Talks to this judge and sort of empties out his soul and his sins and his questions about his guilt and remorse, and then goes on into life. But the thing that's really important in this book, because all of that sort of could just be like a Louis L'Amour adventure story. It could just be a dime store novel, a country, Wild West adventure book, right? A Billy the Kid sort of, origin story type of thing. But what's interesting is that there are a number of themes in this that really make it more than that. One is that this crossing, again, it's a chasm, and that is the abyss that occurs between the old world and the new world. What is the old world? What's the new world? The new world goes back into the old world, but the old world in Mexico functions as a kind of counterpoint to the way that Texas and America is. There's also in Texas, there's this clear delineation between living off the land and ranch life, and the oncoming very soon industrialism, because people are selling off their property for oil. There's also the difference between Grady and Rollins, the two best friends. There's the difference between this border between he and his love, Alejandra. There's a language border, and then there's the border between youth and manhood. And the book really is a bildungsroman. It's a rite of passage. But what's interesting about this is that it's purely American. It's a very American book, and that's because John Grady, he's not forced to go into this rite of passage. He's not forced to confront his innocence. He already is a man, and his problem is that he wants to own the ranch. He thinks he can take over the running of the ranch in Texas, but circumstances are outside of his control, and he can't get it. They've already sold it off. And so then he goes back into Mexico, where he can live that kind of a life and work his way up from the bottom. And he's unable to do that, again, because of circumstances outside of his control. We have these like monumental mythic forces that are always playing against him and against the characters. And that's sort of why the book is constantly talking about the way nature overlooks the individual. The sequence with John Grady talking to the old woman at the ranch is particularly telling, because her worldview and her history has been determined by the way that her family came into Mexico and what happened to her father. He was this important figure, and he was killed publicly in a political revolution. And so her worldview is totally skewed. She's become a fatalist, and she thinks that she's developed a system of morality, but we reading it know that this is incomprehensible. She's sort of lost in this, but nevertheless, she sticks to it, and John Grady does not exist inside of this. But one thing that's really positive about this is that Grady doesn't lose his soul. In fact, he goes through literal almost death. He's almost killed. He's stabbed and slashed, and he has to fight. He has to fight for who he is, but he doesn't complain, and he only weeps once in the book. And really, the weeping is actually for the fact that he's killed this person who was sent to kill him, and he says maybe he was just a good old boy like me. I mean, what do I know about him? And the judge has to tell him that, well, he probably wasn't a good boy. He was hired to kill you, and it was you or him. So I understand the situation. That's also interesting because again, the character of Judge Holden in Blood Meridian sort of looms over the book. I mean, Blood Meridian really does have this. It's the evening redness in the West is the subtitle, and we have this. We have constant scenes of redness and go west, young man, right? And this the judge, of course, in Blood Meridian, which I've covered, it is a kind of archon. He's a demiurge who is leading this kid figure, a nameless kid. Here we have a kid who has a name. He has a will, and he understands that. And the simplicity of the book is really paradoxical because it's both simple and incredibly complex. It finds a complexity in its simplicity, in what John Grady decides to do. He's action. He reconciles people. He's after love. He wants love, and there's no real mystery to it. The only mystery is the visions that he sees of horses, and he says that the passages about horses are just amazing. I mean, they're really beautiful because he says that the creation of the horse reflects creation and the creation of man, and he says that I think Rollins at one point asked him what would happen in a world without horses, and he answers. Well, God would never let that happen. Horses are created for us, and we have them, and the way that they silhouette against the skyline is beautiful and wondrous. So, just to take you through some parts of the book here, it was published in 1992, and of course, we get the usual Cormac McCarthy syntax. We get these long passages. Harold Bloom, whom I'm going to get into, will discuss the book and mainly Blood Meridian, but this book as Melvillian. It's kind of like you see Melville's Ahab overlooking all of Cormac McCarthy, and that's particularly true. I mean, because there's a kind of Promethean fire that exists in McCarthy that's very strange. It's like the language is written at times in this kind of lightning mystical language of pure truth. But whereas Blood Meridian is something that totally exceeds the bounds of reality. I mean, the language and the imagery and even the narrative itself are so beyond the capacity for us to kind of comprehend in one sitting. It's extremely bloody. It's extremely violent, and that's supposed to be a kind of primordial, abyssal violence. This is something completely different. There's a beauty and a lightness to this text, which is amazing. So it starts off, he says, the candle flame and the image of the candle flame caught in the pier glass, twisted and righted when he entered the hall, and again when he shut the door. He took off his hat and came slowly forward. The floorboards creaked under his boots. In his black suit, he stood in the dark glass where the lilies leaned so palely from their wasted cut glass vase. Along the cold hallway behind him hung the portraits of forebears only dimly known to him, all framed in glass and dimly lit above the narrow wainscoting. He looked down at the guttered candle stub. He pressed his thumbprint in the warm wax pooled on the oak veneer. Lastly, he looked at the face so caved and drawn among the folds of funeral cloth, the yellowed mustache, the eyelids paper thin. That was not sleeping. That was not sleeping. It was dark outside and cold and no wind. In the distance, a calf bawled. He stood with his hat in his hand. You never combed your hair that way in your life, he said. Inside the house, there was no sound save the ticking of the mantel clock in the front room. He went out and shut the door. Dark and cold and no wind and a thin gray reef beginning along the eastern rim of the world. He walked out on the prairie and stood holding his hat like some supplicant to the darkness over them all, and he stood there for a long time. Do you understand? So that already sets us apart from the dime store novel or from the cowboy story, because one thing that McCarthy does so brilliantly is he turns his nouns into verbs, and he turns his verbs into evocative imagery where we are in the exact time and place. Everything is active and happening now, and we have no doubt about the sensory detail. We can hear everything, we can smell it, we can taste it, we understand every little creak of a floorboard, we understand exactly the way that the guy's standing. And this is so crazy because the reason this is so amazing is that unlike No Country for Old Men, which is written equally brilliantly, but in a completely different way. Or let's take a screenplay. Let's just take any screenplay where we have descriptions of characters doing things. We're told what they're doing. We have stage directions. If we're reading a play, we have stage directions. But what we have here is, yeah, I'm calling Louis L'Amour dime store. My granddad had a million Louis L'Amour novels in this bookcase, and I always thought of them as dime store novels because they're paperbacks where you can tell everything that's going to happen in the book by the covers of the book. Don't judge a book by its cover. And obviously, I'm being sort of glib here, but where the action is easy to understand. Even take something like a more popular thing, like remember when Lonesome Dove, if you guys were alive, remember Lonesome Dove came out, there was the books, and then they had the long series. I remember watching that as a kid. And again, it's not to say it's better or worse. I'm just saying, and that's not a shot at it. It's just saying that there's a simplicity to the adventure style and the hero's journey. And then this, it doesn't matter the labels. It doesn't matter a postmodernism or a modernism. None of that really matters. And I've talked about this before, all that matters is good and bad, right? There's great writing and there's writing. There's good and bad. And the bad circle is a lot larger than the good circle. And in this, what makes it good is not the artistic, artsy detail or the inventiveness of it. It's the fact that McCarthy knows the rules, and when he breaks the rules, we can see the structure of the rules that he's broken within the sentences. So, in other words, it doesn't matter if we have strings of words or details or things in an interesting syntax. None of that really matters. What matters is if it's loyal to the tempo, if it's loyal to the theme, if it's loyal to the narrative structure, and if we find it interesting and we get into it, and then we're either uplifted or we find something brilliant or beautiful about the world, right? Truth, beauty, and goodness. And Blood Meridian is a good example of this because it's so terrifying in its beauty, right? It's so otherworldly. But this one so far, we just start off with just a basic story. But yet sentences like he walked out on the prairie and stood holding his hat like some supplicant to the darkness, that elevates it. Because now we have something metaphysical. Now we know that John Grady, whom we don't know him by name yet in the book, we know that he is going to be walking into the darkness of his life, and he's going to try to find lightness. He's going to try to find who he is, try to find goodness, and that's what we learn about John Grady. We don't get that with the kid. But he's a kind of weird, like a pilgrim walking across borders into the wilderness. We get these long sentences. We even get Grail imagery here on the first few pages. All of them pledged in blood and redeemable in blood only. Cormac McCarthy once said in an interview that nothing happens in the world. It is impossible to live life without shedding blood, is what he says. He says, above all, the low chant of the traveling song which the riders sang as they rode, nation and ghost of nation, passing in a soft chorale across the mineral waste to darkness, bearing loss to all history and all remembrance, like a grail, the sum of their secular and transitory and violent lives. What other... That's a perfect description of seeing the Comanche, right, in their long caravan walking across the West. And in fact, the book is kind of framed in that sense because we see the old world, the new world, and then we see the Comanche at the beginning and then at the end. And John Grady's father is going to actually make a statement where he says at one point that he feels like the Comanche must have felt. They have their world, and then an alien world comes in and takes it, and it's gone. But he's unable to see the irony in this. But it doesn't matter because the truth of it is still there. He's talking about sort of eons of people coming and going in this vast landscape. He says he rode with the West, coppering his face in the red wind blowing out of the West. He turned south along the old war trail, and he rode out to the crest of a low rise and dismounted and dropped the reins and walked out and stood like a man come to the end of something. There was an old horse skull in the brush, and he squatted and picked it up and turned it in his hands, frail and brittle, bleached paper white. He squatted in the long light holding it, the comic book teeth loose in the sockets, the joints in the cranium like a ragged welding of the bone plates, the muted run of sand in the brain box when he turned it. Here we get horses. What he loved in horses was what he loved in men, the blood and the heat of the blood that ran them. All his reverence and all his fondness and all his leanings of his life were for the ardent-hearted, and they would always be so and never be otherwise. I love that he says ardent-hearted, right? Like it's mythical. It's like the Forest of Arden, which is in As You Like It, which I'm going to be doing soon, set in the Forest of Arden. He goes through his lineage here. On page 7, his grandfather was the oldest of 8 boys and the only one to live past the age of 25. They were drowned, shot, kicked by horses. They perished in fires. They seemed to fear only dying in bed. The last 2 were killed in Puerto Rico in 1898. And in that year, he married and brought his bride home to the ranch and must have walked out and stood looking at the holdings and reflected long upon the ways of God and the laws of primogeniture. A year later, he married his dead wife's older sister, and a year after this, the boy's mother was born, and that was all the mourning that there was. The Grady name was buried with the old man the day the Norther blew the lawn chairs over the dead cemetery grass. The boy's name was Cole, John Grady Cole. It's so fantastic, dude. So let's get to a couple of... Okay, so when he's talking to his dad, there's this real Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Rosencrantz scene, perfect symmetry here. He says, last conversation we had was in San Diego, California in 1942. It ain't her fault. It ain't the same as I was. I'd like to think I am, but I ain't. You are inside. Inside you are. Interesting that McCarthy does these little twists, right? This is a perfectly symmetrical phrase. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, right? Says Blake about the tiger. And here we are with a kind of Shakespearean, again, Rosencrantz, Guildenstern, Rosencrantz. Inside you are inside. He's saying here that you are complete. I am incomplete. Your mother is selling the ranch. I'm incomplete. I can't do anything to help you. You're going to have to make your own way. The good book says that the meek shall inherit the earth, and I expect that's probably the truth. I ain't no free thinker, but I'll tell you what, I'm a long way from being convinced that it's all that good a thing, he says. That's the father. The father says that because he's come back from World War II. He's broken. He doesn't understand. He is completely broken in the landscape. Again, this is where postmodernism is in the book because again, we have characters traversing a broken landscape, a fragmented landscape, which is it's the exterior symbol of how they are on the inside, of their interior broken state. But John Grady Cole is not broken yet. So he leaves so that he won't be broken like his father, and he goes off to make himself a man. So he leaves, he goes off to Mexico, and he's got Rollins with him, and he says on page 30, when they're riding out, he says, they rode out along the fence line and across the open pasture land. The leather creaked in the morning cold. Isn't that a perfect description? This is great writing. This is showing and not telling. Yes, he is telling us what he's doing because the speaker is showing us the words here. One thing that Harold Bloom says is that Cormac McCarthy was the same age as John Grady Cole in 1948. But he says that the similarities end there. There's as much similarity between Cormac McCarthy and John Grady Cole as there is between Shakespeare and Hamlet. We don't know what the author's life is, and it doesn't. This is a great example of it doesn't matter. Once the pen is to the page, this is a different character, and this is something that goes beyond the bounds of just one person. This is truth. This is truthful writing. The leather creaked in the morning cold is cacophonous. You can hear the leather waking up in the morning cold. They pushed the horses into a lope. The lights fell away behind them. They rode out on the high prairie where they slowed the horses to a walk, and the stars swarmed around them out of the blackness. They heard somewhere in that tenantless night a bell that tolled and ceased where no bell was, and they rode out on the round dais of the earth, which alone was dark and no light to it, which carried their figures and bore them up into the swarming stars, so that they rode not under but among them, and they rode at once jaunty and circumspect, like thieves newly loosed in that dark electric. Like young thieves in a glowing orchard, loosely jacketed against the cold in 10,000 worlds for the choosing. It's Edenic, right? This is where the landscape, the land and the nightscape and the firmament and the sky, the stars and the sky function as it's almost like they are the hunters themselves going into the sky. They have limitless possibilities. They're young and they're full of life. It's Edenic. And one thing I said later on, this comment that I wrote later, is about the. It's set. I wrote. Let's see. Yes, stars. Stars trace the arc of the hemisphere. Nocturnal sky continues to shimmer over the events of the characters. And let's see. Let me find my. I'll find my passage here about what I wrote about the way that it constantly punctuates their action. Because this occurs throughout. We constantly get descriptions of the night or of the landscape. Okay, so I'll get to it. So let's see. As they move on, they meet John Grady, or sorry, they meet Blevins, and eventually, yeah. So Blevins here talks about when they meet the kid, who again we thought John Grady was the kid. Now we meet a younger kid. Remember, there was the kid in Blood Meridian. Thanks everybody for being here. By the way, like and share. Thank you for being here. Make sure you like the stream afterwards. Leave a comment for me afterwards. You can super chat me. You can super chat me. You can also support me with the links provided. Jason's been dropping those links. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. This says, the storm front towered above them in the wind was cool on their sweating faces. They slumped bleary-eyed in their saddles and looked at one another. Shrouded in the black thunderheads, the distant lighting glowed mutely like welding seen through foundry smoke, as if repairs were underway at some flawed place in the iron dark of the world. That's a Melvillian image. That's a pure, like, Ahabian Moby Dick image, right? Where, of course, we get Ahab forging the harpoon underneath the floorboards of the ship, as if he's forging it with lightning, like he's Vulcan, or he's a volcanic character about to give it to Zeus, or he's an archon. It says, my granddaddy was killed. This is Blevins talking. My granddaddy was killed in a mine bucket in West Virginia. It run down in a hole 180 feet to get him. It couldn't even wait for it. This is talking about lightning. To get to the top, they had to wet down the bucket to cool it before they could get him out of it. Him and two other men. It fried him like bacon. My daddy's older brother was blowed out of a derrick in the Batson field in the year 1904. Cable rig with a wood derrick, but the lightning got him anyways, and him not 19-year-old. Great uncle on my mother's side, I said, got killed on a horse, and it never singed a hair on that horse, and it killed him graveyard dead. They had to cut his belt off him where it welded the buckle shut. And I got a cousin 8 but 4 years older than me, was struck down in his own yard coming from the barn, and it paralyzed him all down one side and melted the fillings in his teeth and soldered his jaw shut. And Rollins says, I told you, he's gone completely dipshit. Like, this guy's just telling stories, right? They didn't know what was wrong with him. He didn't just twitch and mumble and point at his mouth like, that's an out-and-out lie, and I never heard one, said Rollins. Blevins didn't hear. Beads of sweat stood on his forehead. Another cousin of my daddy's side had got him. It set his hair on fire. The change in his pocket burned through and fell out on the ground and set the grass alight. I done been struck twice. How come me to be deaf in this one ear? I'm double bred for death by fire. You got to get away from anything metal at all. You don't know what you'll get. Brads in your overalls, nails in your boots. What do you intend to do? Try and outride it, he said. Only chance I got. There's a lightning storm coming on. So Blevins is both the kid and he talks like a older, wiser figure. This is the most that he really talks in the whole book, but he's terrified of lightning. And he knows that the lightning storm is going on. And I believe him. I mean, we, the reader, I think we should believe him at this point, where his family has been cursed with these continuous lightning strikes, if not for the literal reason that they're out on the range all the time, full of metal. But figuratively speaking, because he is cursed in the book, but that's through his own free will. It's through he curses himself through his own actions, right? He constantly thinks that he's living in this old world where he can just shoot a guy and get his horse back. But John Grady is a kind of mediator between this and the other world, where he knows, like, we're going to get your horse back, but you still got to play by the rules of society. People are going to come after you. You can't just do this stuff. But anyway, Blevins ends up taking off all his clothes, running out, and then he loses his clothes in the lightning storm, and the storm comes, and then his horse gets taken away. It says Rollins by page 71. By dark, the storm had slacked and the rain had almost ceased. They pulled the wet saddles off the horses and hobbled them and walked off in separate directions through the chaparral to the stand, straddle-legged, clutching their knees and vomiting. The browsing horses jerked their heads up. It was no sound they'd ever heard before. In the gray twilight, those retchings seemed to echo like the calls of some rude provincial species loosed upon that waste. Something imperfect and malformed lodged in the heart of being, a thing smirking deep in the eyes of grace itself like a gorgon in an autumn pool. They're in like a mythical lightning storm here, and they're retching, and the horses are going crazy. Some of them were alive, page 73, and they twisted on their spines as the horses passed and raised their heads and cried out, but the horsemen rode on. The sun rose up in the sky, and the country took on new color, green fire in the acacia, and palo verde, and green in the roadside runoff grass, and fire in the ocotillo, as if the rain were electric, had grounded circuits that the electric might be. God, it's so fucking good, dude. I mean, I didn't want this to end. Shouts out to Digital Minefield right there. I didn't want the book to end. It's so fantastic. And the way that he frames his paragraphs, right, with subjunctives oftentimes at the end of his paragraphs is amazing. They talk about the firmament right here. He says, if it wasn't for this man, I wouldn't be here at all. I'd have left your ass back up in that arroyo, says Rollins. No, I take back. I'd have left you up on the Pecos. Blevins went to sleep as well. He sat watching the firmament unscroll up from behind the blackened palisades of the mountains to the east. Towards the village, all was darkness. Not even a dog barked. He looked at Rollins, rolled asleep in his sugan, and he knew that he was right in all he said, and there was no help for it, and the dipper standing at the northern edge of the world turned, and the night was a long time passing. You get the biblical ands, right? This is the same thing with we talked about this with Walt Whitman and with Herman Melville. The way that when a narrative lengthens, when it's long, when it keeps rolling out and keeps unscrolling, it's interesting. He said unscrolls here. The night unscrolls, the sky unscrolls, like it's written, like the stars are written on a scroll in the sky. What that is to say, we were punctuated by conjunctions. We have ands. Everything is continuous. There's no stopping. And that's to show that the characters are living their lives, but the differentiation comes in this when we get the old lady who later on is pure fatalism, as if you are living in the world and nothing you do matters and you just keep on going, right? All the choices are made for you and you just got to live out to the end. It's almost Macbethian. I mean, Macbeth is really like a literary concept, he's illustrative of pure liberty because Macbeth is able to do anything with impunity. He keeps going, until he finds out through his occult meddling, through his weirding way, right? In Dune. I don't know Dune, but I know the weirding way, and weird, W-Y-R-D, fate. He meets with the weird sisters, the three fates, and he keeps going. He finds out that, oh no, despair thy charm, right? Let the angel whom thou hast served tell thee, I was from my mother's womb untimely ripped. And Macbeth says, I'm gonna go till the last, till I'm dead. But Macbeth is illustrative of pure liberty because what does he do? He kills with impunity. He just goes on. He has no rules anymore, no rules for himself. The only thing is to keep him alive. But this is different. That Blood Meridian sort of functions in that way. I mean, the judge is a demiurge, but this is different. This is characters who are alive and agents and have free will, and yet are looking at nature unrolling around them. It's quite beautiful. Here's my note that I wrote. All notions in the narrative punctuated by a nocturnal chorus of silent firmament, or a cacophonous chaparral of landscape. These are small characters in an infinite time space, and they have meaning and free will. That's it. I mean, that's essentially why it keeps being punctuated by that. See. Yeah, the language, oh my God, I forgot about the scene. So there's this great scene where, this is pure Cormac McCarthy. There's a scene where they're talking to Blevins, and he's talking about skinning a buck. And listen, I'll just read what it says here instead of doing a parody of it. He says, they shot a buck. If we don't found her on deer meat, he says we gotta eat. It was like looking through something. He says, I've seen them vaqueros work for Blair, cut a yearling heifer so thin you could see through the meat. They'd bone one out damn near in one long sheet. They'd hang the meat on poles all the way around the fire like laundry, and if you come up on it at night, you wouldn't know what it was. It was like looking through something and seeing its heart. They turn the meat and mend the fire in the night, and you'd see them moving around inside it. You wake up in the night, and this thing would be setting out there on the prairie in the wind, and it would be glowing like a hot stove, just red as blood. so it's like the language of just skinning the buck and eating. He's like, well, I remember back on Blair. I'm gonna do my parody here. I remember back on the Blair Ranch when them Comanches would come and skin a buck. They'd skin it so thin with an obsidian blade, just like a razor. They'd hang it up in the sun to dry, but the sun was hot, and the hot heat kept beating down on the thin curtains of all that flesh, and they made it out into one sheet like they was sailing through the seas of the red sun, parting the seas, just like I walked into a room full of blood, looking through like shadows on the wind. And I could see the heart of the whole world beating inside of it, down to the primordial earth. It's not very good, but there's a conversation between Rollins and John Grady. He says, "You think God looks out for people?" Said Rollins. I love this. Yeah, I think he does. You? Yeah, I do. Way the world is, somebody can wake up and sneeze somewhere in Arkansas or some damn place, and before you're done, there's wars and ruination and all hell. You don't know what's going to happen. I'd say he's just about got to. I don't believe we'd make it a day otherwise. That's brilliant, because that's I didn't expect that from this book. I expected a lot more fatalism in the book, and what that shows you is that John Grady and Rollins together in friendship. So it's mimicking the adventure story, right, of the two friends going out into the world and seeking adventure, but they're determining their worldview here, and it's one of Christianity. They're saying that they could think that ruination and hell and bloodshed and war, the war that's just happened, and people dying all over the place, and the way that, remember in Thin Red Line, look at nature's cruel, Starls. Look at nature's cruel. Look at that tree, the way the vines go around everything, strangling everything. It's cruel, Starls. Remember that? But this is different. They're saying nothing could exist here if it wasn't for God's infinite mercy and infinite activity in the world. Right? We have to. He says people, it's basically where we live in a fallen world. We can't do these things alone. Out on the plain in the shoreless night, they could see a reflection of their own fire in a dark lake, the fire of the vaqueros 5 miles away. It rained in the night, and the rain hissed in the fire, and the horses came in out of the darkness and stood with their red eyes shifting and blinking. In the morning, it was cold and gray, and the sun a long time coming. Let's see. He says, I wrote on page 94 here, the way that the paragraphs lengthen with the lush landscape. So as they keep going south and the landscape opens up into lush, verdant fields, they get out of the kind of dry prairie desert and they get into green fields, the paragraphs start to lengthen. And then he sees Alejandra. Alejandra, 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 Alejandra. Remember that Lady Gaga song? You didn't think you'd get a Lady Gaga reference here, did you? I pulled that one from the old Memory Palace, right? Lady Gaga's real name, Stephanie Germanata. I learned that from an American Dad episode the other night. No, Alejandra. Yeah, and she's beautiful. It says she wore English riding boots and jodhpurs and a blue twill hacking jacket, and she carried a riding crop, and the horse she rode was a black Arabian saddle horse. She's already better than them, right, in terms of their societal level. These guys are going to be ranch hands, and she's obviously the daughter of the owner of the ranch. So think of, I don't know, what do you think of, Yellowstone or something? I've only watched a few episodes of Yellowstone, but you think of Yellowstone like, these guys who own 10 bazillion hectares of land or whatever. They own half of, Chihuahua State, right? They own all of the Yucatan Peninsula, And the guy has a daughter, and she goes to private school, and she's riding an Arabian horse, so she's on a different level. And what's funny about this is that his author's taking over. Yeah. That was my programming word. Alejandra, man, I'm theta clear. No. Is that this is also, and now is a good time to mention, I guess, that, okay, one thing, I'll get to that. One thing about Yellowstone that's funny is that they're in Montana, and they got this big ranch, and this guy's he's going to be governor or whatever. He's going to be president. He's, gigantic landowner, and it's great. I mean, I watched the first, I think, a couple episodes of the first season or the second season. I watched it when he said, yeah, you're going to take that long black train. Yeah, we're going to give you a ride. You can ride out to town. He's going to drop you off at that long black train. All right, pushes him over the edge of the cliff, right? Yeah, that's what's interesting about that is that I have a friend who, for all intents and purposes, is probably as close to being what they, not how they're portrayed in the show, which is like ruthless, all this stuff. But in terms of their status, I have a friend who's about as close as that as you can get, probably more. And I remember talking to him about the show. I asked him about it, and I was like, hey, man, what do you think of Yellowstone? He was like, great show. And I was like, is it true all this infighting and all this shenanigans and, all the Machiavellian stuff going on? He was like, no, it's total. It's a TV show. It's just made up. And now, you could say, well, of course he would say that, but he's one of my oldest friends. He's just like, no, it's made up for the show. And that's a great show. And it is indicative, obviously, of there are people like that. But in terms of where they set the show and the characters there in Montana, I just thought it was interesting that, his family they're at the same level, but they don't have any of that shit. But they have all the stuff, but they don't have any of that, any of the Machiavellian stuff. So I just thought it was interesting because there are families like that, of course, and all over the world, and globalism, and and the show is obviously supposed to be a microcosm of the way that these things work and a statement about America. But I just thought that was interesting. But anyway, what I was going to say about the book is that that's what he wants me to think, man. Yeah, exactly. Is that the book is also a Romeo and Juliet. Because of course we have John Grady Cole, who's a kind of a Montague here. His family's rich in Texas. They're going to sell off their land. They're going to own a bunch of oil land and probably prosper again. Of course, that's his reason for leaving. He wants to make it himself. He wants to own the place. He wants to be traditional to the land instead of the oncoming industrialism, which they don't know about yet. So it's kind of prior to that in terms of the locus. But Alejandra is Capulet, right? They're from different sides of the border. They're from different sides of society. They don't know this guy. He's come out of nowhere. He's an outsider. He came in with Blevins. Blevins is suspected of killing a guy. They were horse thieves. They don't know who they are. They have no way to check it. There's no way to check it. And the way that justice works in this book, and as they go further south, is a kind of a verbal justice. It's whatever you can pay for. You're only going to get into jail. When he goes to jail, he's only going to get what he can pay for and what he can fight for, and that's it. He has no title. He's got no pedigree following him because he's chosen to set out on his own. But John Grady is aware of that, and he takes all that into account kind of subconsciously when he goes, but he never complains about it, and he fights for what's his, which is interesting. He never tries to get out of it by writing to anybody. He never tries to, snitch on anyone. He's there with his buddy, and they fight for what's theirs and what they want. And and the most important part is that he feels remorse, even though he doesn't like Blevins, and Blevins got him in all this trouble. There was no reason why they had to go and kill the kid. There was no reason they didn't have to do that. They had their reasons for doing it, but he doesn't like that, and he wants to make things right. And he feels remorse about it, which is beautiful. And in the end, it's a kind of Romeo and Juliet because John Grady says, "Look, I'll do anything you want me to do. I'll whatever you want me to do, I'll do it as long as we're together." which is interesting. He's not simping for her. He has a kind of there's what's funny is that the aspect of lust, which could play into this book very, it could be loud in this book because he's a young guy and she's his age, she's young, and and she's beautiful. But that never once plays into the book. It never once do we get that idea coming into it. It's love, and even the love scenes together are kind of outside of the book. It's wholesome, which is weird for a Cormac McCarthy book. I guess the love scenes themselves are kind of weird for a McCarthy book, but she'd been riding the horse on the river or in the Cienegas because the horse was wet to its belly and the leather fenders of the saddle were dark, their lower edges and her boots as well. She wore a flat-crowned hat of black felt with a wide brim, and her black hair was loose under it and fell halfway to her waist as she rode past. She turned and smiled and touched the brim of the hat with her crop, and the vaqueros touched their hat brims one by one, down to the last of those who'd pretended not even to see her as she passed. Then she pushed the horse into a gated rack and disappeared down the road, so that we know that they are paying fealty to her. We know she's somebody. Right. Early darkness where the moon was rising and the cattle were calling, and the yellow squares of window light gave warmth and shape to an alien world. Fucking hell, man. He's so good. And then what do they say about when they get hired on this ranch? Their conversation is great. I believe those are some pretty good old boys, whispered Rollins. Yeah, I believe they are. You see them old high-back center fire rigs? Yep. You reckon they think we're on the run down here, ain't we? Rollins didn't answer. After a while, he said, I like hearing the cattle out there. Yeah, I do too. He didn't say much about Roca, did he? Not a lot. You reckon that was his daughter? I'd say it was. This is some country, ain't it? Yeah, it is. Go to sleep. Bud? Yeah. This is how it was with the old Waddies, ain't it? Yeah. How long do you think you'd like to stay here? About 100 years. Go to sleep. That's great. It reminds me of when you're young and like your buddy comes to spend the night, and you're lying there, you're going to sleep. Your buddy's in the trundle bed, or in the usually when you're a kid, you got either two beds in the room, you got a trundle bed or whatever, and y'all are both lying there, or you're in the living room, you're on the sofa, he's on the floor, whatever it is, but you're lying there and you're talking to each other in the dark until finally you just fall asleep and you don't even know it. But you would have those conversations. I remember the last time I had a conversation like that. When I was 13, I was staying at my friend Taylor's mountain house. And I remember in that guest room, there were 3 beds in the guest room, and I remember we were waiting for his brother to get there. God rest his soul. And we were lying there, and I remember talking till we just got, I guess, swallowed up by dark sleep. Anyway, so moving on here, I'm going to skip way ahead because I'm going to get to where they're in jail. And this is pretty interesting. So what we get here is, you see how on the page, if you can see here on the page, like the paragraphs lengthen. You see how this paragraph is really long, right? And we have these longer paragraphs, and that's because not here we don't have the long landscape. Right here we've got the insular prisonscape where all is darkness, and they're constantly hiding in corners and waiting for somebody to come out and knife them. And so time starts to seem endless in here, even though all they've got is time, but they never have time enough. And they even mention that. And this says, the guy came after him. His movements were precise and without rancor. John Grady knew that he was hired. He swung the tray at his head, and the cuchillero ducked and feinted and came forward. John Grady gripped the tray and moved along the wall. He ran his tongue into the corner of his mouth and tasted blood. He knew his face had been cut, but he didn't know how bad. He knew the cuchillero had been hired because he was a man of reputation, and it occurred to him that he was going to die in this place. He looked deep into those dark eyes, and there were deeps there to look into. A whole malign history, burning cold and remote and black. He moved along the wall, slicing back at the cuchillero with the tray. He was cut again across the outside of his upper arm. He was cut across his lower chest. He turned and slashed twice at the cuchillero with his knife. The man sucked himself up away from the blade with the boneless grace of a dervish. The men sitting at the table, they were approaching, had begun to rise one by one silently from the benches like birds leaving a wire. John Grady turned again and hacked at the cuchillero with his tray, and the cuchillero squatted, and he saw him there, thin and bow-legged, under his outflung arm for one frozen moment, like some dark and reedy homunculus bent among inhabiting him. The knife passed across his chest and passed back, and the figure moved with incredible speed. It again stood before him, crouching silently, faintly weaving, watching his eyes. They were watching so they could see if death were coming. Eyes that had seen it before and knew the colors it traveled under and what it looked like when it got there. He sat quietly on the table. He leaned and took hold of John Grady by the hair and forced his head back to cut his throat. As he did so, John Grady brought his knife up from the floor and sank it into the cuchillero's heart. He sank it into his heart and snapped the handle sideways and broke the blade off in him. The cuchillero's knife clattered on the floor. From the red boutonniere blossoming on the left pocket of his blue work shirt, there spurted a thin fan of bright arterial blood. He dropped to his knees and pitched forward dead into the arms of his enemy. I mean, you couldn't get a more accurate, more poetic play-by-play of this fight with all of the metaphysical energy of what's just happened here, with all the whole history of these two characters tied into it, into the words themselves. We see these two guys existing from the beginning of when they were born up until this moment, and one of them is going to go past the point of death, and the other is not. And the way that the thing that really gets me, and this is McCarthy at his best here, is how he describes objects as containing the action of bloodshed. So he says from the red boutonniere, right? It's like they've suddenly come into this whirling dervish of a mystical dance, right? And it's for life itself. It's for life and death. And the boutonniere is blossoming. We can see exactly where he's been stabbed, and we can see the blood blossoming out like he's wearing an ornament, right? And then it spurted out a thin fan of bright arterial blood. Now that's not to put a label on it, but that is really something that I've seen in through all these texts that's especially suggestive of postmodern work. I don't know why. I don't know what it is about it, but we often get fans of blood, right? Or we get a blood spray, but it's not biological, it's not typical, it's not a crime scene description. It's something that it's arcing out. It contains motion, and it's something that's like a terrifying, terrible beauty in the Yeatsian sense. We got this in Bret Easton Ellis. We got it in American Psycho. You remember even when I read that brief description of Prince Harry's autobiography that time, which I still need to do that, but the whole book, I still need to do that. Would you guys? I mean, I think, look, I'll read it so you don't have to. But there was that description that he said in that one part about when he was at war and he noticed the fan of blood, right, spraying across his face. And it's something that, it's a description. I think that the reason that they use these writers use this description is because it's something that almost seems commonplace, like a commonplace image or a commonplace object, but it becomes something overloaded with something you couldn't ever comprehend before the moment happens. Right? Let's see, page 204. Okay, here's the part where he wakes up after 3 days because John Grady pitches forward and he's also worn out. He's about to die, and a guy comes out of the darkness and takes him away into a kind of a tomb. So here we have a really highly allegorical part of the book. He says he lay there 3 days. He slept and woke and slept again. Someone turned off the light and he woke in the dark. He called out, but no one answered. He thought of his father in Goshi. He knew that terrible things had been done to him there, and he always believed that he did not want to know about it, but he did want to know. He lay in the dark thinking of all the things he did not know about his father, and he realized that the father he knew was all the father he would ever know. So this is the first time he thinks of his father, right? Really the whole time he's been on this trip, and where he really thinks deeply about his father, because his father was tortured in the war, and now he's gone through the same thing as his father. But notice the allegorical images. I mean, he's been held captive and tortured for something that he's accused of, right? They have accusers. He can't even face his accusers. And basically they just assume his guilt and that's it. And they're going to crucify him here. But the crucifixion here this is allegorical, right? So what we're supposed to do as the reader is see that we have a hero who is going through a life and death phase and is going to emerge. And however he emerges from this, right? If he emerges, it's going to be with the power of God. God is who raises him up out of this. And that's where he's going to find his faith. And he doesn't specifically say so in the book like that, but when he gets to the judge at the end of the book, he goes and sees the judge, who is a kind of father figure. And when he sees the judge, he confesses his sins, right? He confesses. And from that, he feels, he obviously feels remorse for what he's done. And he finds a kind of solace in the way that the judge gives him, it consoles him. And from there, he goes off into his land. He comes back out of the wilderness and he finds love and he finds living. He's going to keep living. And that's one interesting thing about John Grady Cole in this is that he's young and he doesn't get jaded to the point where he loses his innocence. He actually maintains an innocence throughout the rest of the book, even towards the end of the book, which is very wild for Cormac McCarthy. He almost never does that. Remember at the end of Blood Meridian, we have the judge dancing in the digging pits of fire in the landscape, right? As if we're going to go into this forged post-industrial landscape of this hellish broken world. But here, and the kid doesn't escape the prison planet, right? Here, the kid escapes and he makes his way back and he still has life and he's still in love with life. It says, he slept, and when he woke, he dreamt of the dead standing about in their bones and the dark sockets of their eyes that were indeed without speculation bottomed in the void, wherein lay a terrible intelligence common to all, but of which none would speak. When he woke, he knew that men had died in that room, right? Like he's in hell, like he's harrowing hell. And then in the third day, he's going to rise. Right? And he says, both him and his brother, you're both fortunate boys. I don't feel so fortunate. Fortunate boys, he said, and nodded left. And then he says he practiced walking up and down. He polished the underside of the mess tray with the sleeve of his shift, and standing in the center of the room under a light bulb, he studied the face that peered dimly out of the warped steel like some maimed and raging djinn and conjured there. He peeled away the bandage from his face and inspected the stitches in there and felt them with his fingers. Someone had washed the blood out of his boots, and they were still wet, and he tried to take them off again, but he could not, and he lay on the bunk in his clothes and boots waiting for God knew what. Once he gets outside, it's like a cathedral dome, he says. And then finally, he meets up with Rollins. They get out of jail. They're released. And he says, he meets up with Rollins and he says, I wouldn't have left you. Yeah, I know you wouldn't. That don't mean it ain't dumb. Rollins almost smiled. Then he looked away. The waiter brought the coffee. There was another boy in there, said Rollins, all cut up. Probably wasn't a bad boy. See, set out on Saturday night with a few dollars in his pocket. What happened to him? He died. When they carried him out of there, I thought how peculiar it would have seemed to him if he could have seen it. It did to me, and it wasn't even me. Dying ain't in people's plans, is it? No. He nodded. They put Mexican blood in me, he says. He looked up. And John Grady was lighting a cigarette. He shook out the match and put it in the ashtray and looked at Rollins. So what does that mean? Mean about what? Well, does it mean I'm part Mexican? And John Grady drew on the cigarette and leaned back and blew the smoke into the air. Part Mexican? He said, yeah. How much did they put? They said it was over a liter. How much over a liter? I don't know. Well, a liter would make you almost a half-breed. Rollins looked at him. It doesn't, does it? No, hell, it don't mean nothing. Blood's blood. It don't matter where it come from. And then he says he's going to go home. Now, it's interesting because that would allow him in his mind to kind of merge with how he's going to find Alejandra. And he says he's going to go home. All right, you guess you're going back down there, ain't you? Said Rollins. Yes, I guess I am. On account of the girl? Yeah. What about the horses? The girl and the horses. He's going to go find them horses. And then on page 221, he says, the girls set out the dishes on little pallets made from the ends of crates that nothing overbalanced the uncertain surface of the table, and an old man at the farthest end of the table prayed for them all. He asked that God remember those who had died, And he asked that the living gathered together here remember that the corn grows by the will of God, and beyond that will there is neither corn nor growing, nor light, nor air, nor rain, nor anything at all save only darkness. And then they ate. Amen. Right? Okay, then he goes and meets with the lady, and she tells him about her tainted blood and her family curse. I'm going to kind of skip over this. It's one of the most important parts of the book, but I'm going to kind of skip it because I already talked about what it means and her fatalism. But then we get to he finds Alejandra, and he meets with her, and she says, "Hey," and she says, he looked into those blue eyes like a man seeking some vision of the increate future of the universe. Jeez. Right? I say amen too. I said amen because I figured John Grady would say amen, but I say amen. And then let's see, yeah, Romeo and Juliet here. So the deal was that she would have to turn him away if her aunt had paid for him to get out of jail, which she did, but he goes and sees her anyway. I told her I would not be blackmailed. She made me crazy. Do you hate her? No, I don't hate her. The next morning he left daylight. I think he was going to kill you. So John Grady realizes that her dad had stopped loving her when he found out that Alejandra and John Grady were together, and then he left off into the darkness in the distance, and John Grady thinks that he was going to come kill him. Don't cry, Alejandra. Don't cry. Don't cry, Alejandra. Don't cry, Alejandra. Oh, Alejandra, don't you cry. She shook her head. I destroyed everything. I only wanted to die. Don't cry. I'll make it all right. You can't, she said. She raised her head and looked at him. He'd never seen despair before. He thought he had, but he had not. Damn, that's pretty powerful, right? So he's been hunted. He's been tortured. They tried to kill him. He's been in jail. He almost died. He saw Blevins, or he heard Blevins get killed. And yet he says, I'd never heard despair before until it came to looking in the eyes of Alejandra and noticing that she almost lost her love. And he says that was despair. Right? Abandon all hope, ye enter here. All ye who enter here, right? In Dante's Inferno, right? They go into Dante's Inferno, and that's because it's despair in the city of Dis. They will never have hope again. Of course, they choose to be there walking in, but they chose to do that. But, hey. Look, he lay listening to the horse crop at the grass at his stake rope, and he listened to the wind and his emptiness and watched stars trace the arc of the hemisphere and die in the darkness at the edge of the world. And as he lay there, the agony in his heart was like a stake. He imagined the pain of the world to be like some formless parasitic being seeking out the warmth of human souls wherein to incubate. And he thought he knew what made one liable to its visitations. Again, punctuating this atmosphere, and he sees evil permeating people into how they choose to act. Here's about the horses. Okay, this is page 280. He says, in his sleep, he could hear the horses stepping among the rocks, and he could hear them drink from the shallow pools in the dark, where the rocks lay smooth and rectilinear as the stones of ancient ruins, and the water from their muzzles dripped and rang like water dripping in a well. And in his sleep he dreamt of horses, and the horses in his dream moved gravely among the tilted stones like horses come upon an antique site where some ordering of the world had failed, and if anything had been written on the stones, the weathers had taken away again. And the horses were wary and moved with great circumspection, carrying in their blood as they did the recollection of this and other places where horses once had been and would be again. Finally, what he saw in his dream was that the order in the horse's heart was more durable, for it was written in a place where no rain could erase it. On page 282, we do have a kind of a Gnostic vision of beauty here, which is, he says he thought that in the beauty of the world were hid a secret. He thought the world's heart beat at some terrible cost, and that the world's pain and its beauty moved in a relationship of diverging equity, and that in this headlong deficit, the blood of multitudes might ultimately be exacted for the vision of a single flower. That's Blakean. That's almost Blakean. By noon, the horses were in snow, and there was snow in the pass, and the horses trod and broke thin plates of ice in the trail, wherein the snow melt ran out over the wet black ground, dark as ink, and they toiled up through the patches of snow glazing over in the sun, and rode through a dark corridor of fir trees, and descended along the northern slope through pockets of sunlight, pockets of shadow, where the air smelled of rosin and wet stone, and no birds sang. Oh, this description is great. This is one sentence that is, I mean, just take out of context these singular sentences, and it's beautiful. He says, in the sepia monochrome of a rainy day in that lost village, they'd grown old instantly. God, so good. He's talking about, so what he's talking about here is, as he's going back through and he sees a newlyweds coming out of a Mexican church. And yeah, no, Toledo, I agree. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, no, it's not simping. Yeah, I agree with you. And he sees the Mexican church, and he sees his newlyweds come out, and he says the way that she's leaning on his arm, in the sepia monochrome of a rainy day. So that is a perfect description of the kind of yellowish dust of this particular town. And in that lost village, they'd grown old instantly. These two people are always going to be together. And the way that they lean on each other young, you can see the whole history, future history of their life together. It's beautiful. And he goes back to Langtree. First, he meets with the judge, who I said is not Judge Holden. And this is completely opposed to Blood Meridian in tone. And here's where he confesses. I love this sentence. My daddy used to tell me not to chew on something that was eating you. When I was in the penitentiary down there, I killed a boy. The judge sat back in his chair. Well, he said, I'm sorry to hear that. It keeps bothering me. Well, you must have had some provocation. I did, but it don't help. He tried to kill me with a knife. I just happened to get the best of him. And why does it bother you? I don't know. I don't know nothing about him. I never even knew his name. He could have been a pretty good old boy. I don't know. I don't know what he's supposed to be. I don't know that he's supposed to be dead. He looked up. His eyes were wet in the firelight, and the judge sat watching him. I think he felt a lot like you do. And the judge says that he's had some hard times. He had to sentence someone to old Sparky in 1932, and he thought he could have been a pretty good old boy, but he wasn't. He wasn't. What his deeds? And he says, I think about that day every day. And he says, would you do it again? Yes, he says, I would. And then he talks about the cop that killed Blevins. And he says, the reason I wanted to kill him was because I stood there and I let him walk that boy out in the trees and shoot him, and I never said nothing. Judge says, would it have done any good? No, sir, but that don't make it right. And the judge leaned from his chair and took the poker standing on the hearth and jostled the coals and stood the poker back and folded his hands and looked at the boy. What would you have done if I'd found against you today? I don't know. Well, that's a fair answer, I guess, because John Grady Cole has taken the horses back from the ranch, and he had kidnapped the guy, that corrupt guy, but he takes the horses, gets away, takes the horses, and he takes them all the way back. And his point is he wants to find who actually owns this horse that Blevins had, and that's his newest quest. And so he can't find him. He can't find anybody who owns this horse, but he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be in his soul accused of stealing a horse, even if he's taking the horse back that they stole from him and from Blevins, because Blevins is dead. So he's doing a quest for Blevins. And he goes back, and then finally he goes to this courthouse, and he turns it into the court, and then the court hears this, the judge hears the case, and he tells him, John Grady stands there and tells him, he says, look, I got a whole thing with this horse. Let me tell you the story if you got time. And the judge says, well, I got nothing but time. Go ahead and tell you. And he takes 30 minutes to tell him this whole story the horse, first time he saw him, where it came from, Blevins, and he gets up to the present, and then finally the judge says, well, the horse is yours. And that seems to satisfy and satiate him for the moment, but then later on he goes back to visit the judge at home. And that's where he empties his soul out, and he's trying to find absolution. And then he says, he goes, and then he goes and finds Blevins. There's an actually, so Blevins is the name of the kid, but they know that that's got to be a fake name. So he looks over, because there's a radio show for like a radio Pentecostal preacher named Blevins, and they think that's where the kid got his nom de plume, or his nom de guerre, right? His alias. And then he goes and he finds the actual guy named Jimmy Blevins, who again is this, like, he's like a Billy Graham type guy, I guess, in Texas. And when he shows up, the wife comes out and she says, like, "Oh, do you want him to, bless you and bless the animals?" And he says, "No, I'm here for something else. I'm here to see if this is your horse and if you ever knew this kid." And so the preacher takes him in, and they have dinner together and they talk together. And the preacher goes on to talk about, like, how he found his ministry because he realized that the radio could reach everybody on earth and it could go outside of the earth, and that so his life was going to be spent preaching the gospel so everybody could hear it, including places that he wouldn't know where, like on a shortwave. And the preacher says something interesting. He says, once I got famous for this, people started coming here for me to talk to them, and then they started sending dead people. They started sending their relatives here to see if I could raise them from the dead. And he says they sent dead people, crated them up, and shipped them Railway Express. It got out of hand. You can't do nothing with the dead person. Only Jesus could do that. And then they say, yes. He says, yes, ma'am. He never found the owner of the horse. Along toward the end of February, he drifted north again, trailing the horses in the bar ditches along the edge of the blacktop roads, and the big semis blowing them up against the fences. So now we have the modern world, or postmodern world now, because it's post A-bomb, blowing them up against the fences. We have a clash between the natural world and the industrial world here, and he's still riding this horse. And then he says, he gets on page 301, he stood hat in hand over the unmarked earth. This woman who'd worked for his family 50 years, he gets back home. She'd cared for his mother as a baby, and she'd worked for his family long before his mother was born. She'd known and cared for the wild Grady boys who were his mother's uncles and who had all died so long ago. And he stood holding his hat, and he called her his abuela, and he said goodbye to her in Spanish, and then turned and put on his hat and turned his wet face to the wind. And for a moment he held out his hands as if to steady himself, or as if to bless the ground there, or perhaps as if to slow the world that was rushing away, and seemed to care nothing for the old or the young or the rich or the poor, dark or pale, or he or she, nothing for their struggles, nothing for their names, nothing for the living or the dead. And then in the end, the desert he rode was red, and red the dust he raised, the small dust that powdered the legs, and the horse he rode, the horse he led. In the evening a wind came and reddened all the sky before him. There were few cattle in that country, because it was barren country indeed, yet he came at evening upon a solitary but bull rolling in the dust against the blood-red sunset like an animal in sacrificial torment. The blood-red dust blew down out of the sun. He touched the horse with his heels and rode on. He rode with the sun coppering his face and the red wind blowing out of the west across the evening land, and the small desert birds flew chittering among the dry bracken, and horses and rider and horse passed on, and their long shadows passed in tandem like the shadow of a single being, passed and paled into the darkening land, the world to come. And I said the ending of McCarthy books is passing into the land, lighting fires, shadows, foreshadowing in the postscript, in Blood Meridian, and a kind of Gnostic leveling up. But this book is not Gnostic, which is weird because we never really get that. We rarely get that in modern novels, especially postmodern novels. And so here's what Bloom says. If there's a pragmatic tradition of the American sublime, then Cormac McCarthy's fictions are its culmination. Moby Dick and Faulkner's major early novels are McCarthy's prime precursors. Melville's Ahab fuses together Shakespeare's tragic protagonists. Hamlet, Lear, Macbeth. It crosses them with a quest, both Promethean and American. Even as Montaigne's Plato became Emerson's, so Melville's Shakespeare becomes Cormac McCarthy's. Interesting analogy. Though critics will go on associating McCarthy with Faulkner, who certainly affected McCarthy's style in Suttree, the visionary of Blood Meridian and the Border trilogy has much less in common with Faulkner and shares more profoundly in Melville's debt to Shakespeare. So, yeah, you should go to, you missed a few. You missed a few of those, Chris. Yeah, you should go, and I discussed this in my stream talking about Faulkner and Southern Gothic. If you might have seen that one, and also, of course, in the Blood Meridian stream. The aesthetic achievement of All the Pretty Horses surpasses that of Cities of the Plain, if only because McCarthy is too deeply invested in John Grady Cole to let the young man, really still a boy, die with the proper distancing of authorial concern. No one will compose a rival to Blood Meridian, not even McCarthy, but All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing are of the eminence of Suttree. And again, I've covered The Crossing, Blood Meridian, and I haven't covered Suttree yet. If I had to choose a narrative by McCarthy that could stand on its own in relation to Blood Meridian, it probably would be All the Pretty Horses. John Grady Cole's quests for freedom and discovers what neither Suttree nor Billy Parham needs to discover, which is that freedom in an American context is another name for solitude. The self's freedom for Cormac McCarthy has no social aspect whatsoever. That's pretty. I mean, you expect nothing less of Bloom, but still revelatory when we read that, because it's absolutely true, right? And that's true of Blood Meridian. It's true of many of these books, which is, again, when they're purely American books, which is that this is different from a European or a globalist mind in the quest for freedom, which is, in the American mind, pure solitude. I speak of McCarthy as a visionary novelist and not necessarily as a citizen of El Paso, Texas. Emerson identified freedom with power, only available at the crossing, in the shooting of a gulf, a darting to an aim. Since we care for Hamlet, even though he cares for none, we have to assume that Shakespeare also had a considerable investment in Hamlet. The richest aspect of All the Pretty Horses is that we learn to care strongly about the development of John Grady Cole, and perhaps we can surmise that Cormac McCarthy is also moved by this most sympathetic of his protagonists. Remember, I did a Hamlet analysis talking about Bloom, where Hamlet is the poem unlimited. Hamlet is the supreme poet in the English language, the character of Hamlet. Speaking, Shakespeare speaking through Hamlet, but this is, again, there's a difference. There's a delineation between Hamlet and Shakespeare. This is a character that exists that supersedes the mind or the life or even the ability of the writer. It's something that takes on a life of its own. All the Pretty Horses was published 7 years after Blood Meridian and is set almost a full century later in history. John Grady Cole is about the same age as McCarthy would have been in 1948. I discussed that. There's no more of an identification between McCarthy and the young Cole, who evidently will not live to see 20, than there is between Shakespeare and Prince Hamlet. And yet the reverberation of an heroic poignance is clearly heard throughout All the Pretty Horses. It may be that McCarthy's hard-won authorial detachment toward the kid in Blood Meridian had cost the novelist too much in the emotional register. Whether my surmise is accurate or not, the reader shares with McCarthy an affectionate stance towards the heroic youth at the center of All the Pretty Horses. And here's where McCarthy's quoted as saying, "There's no such thing as life without bloodshed," and the differences between Faulkner and McCarthy. What's interesting is that in the life of some of these artists, these literary artists, McCarthy is an author, is a writer who we see traverse through the landscape of literature throughout his writing. So he develops. So his early novels are Appalachian, and then they become Western, and he's going west. He's going into the evening redness in the West. Whereas there are some authors and some artists who are they wholly materialize. They never change in a good way. Bloom says that Rimbaud is one of these. Mozart is one of these. There's no difference in terms of development in their artistic skill, in their register, in their entire oeuvre between when they began and when they end. They are as brilliant when they began as if God just created him right there, and they just created from the beginning, and they made everything there. But with McCarthy, we get something different, which is a more normal development, I suppose. It says, considered more accessible than his other work, All the Pretty Horses joins a coming-of-age narrative, a love story, and linear action-driven plot, a combination that won McCarthy popular appeal. Because even after 1984 and 85, Blood Meridian, he still wasn't a popular novelist. You know, he's known as a great novelist, but not popular. He wasn't really selling books. It wasn't until this book, All the Pretty Horses, outsold all of his other books previous combined, his prior works combined. Recognizing the popularity of the narrative, McCarthy commented in the only interview he has granted to date, there isn't a place in the world you can go where they don't know about cowboys and Indians and the myth of the West. Although All the Pretty Horses manifests many qualities of a conventional Western, the novel also complicates the traditional genre and questions the prevailing cowboy myth. That's the American mythos, right? And it's interesting that to date, that was the only interview he'd done, but then he did a bunch after. He even was interviewed by Oprah, remember? He did No Country for Old Men, and then he wrote, of course, he did interviews. He did The Counselor, the movie The Counselor. I got to cover that because it's his only I think it's his only screenplay. He's friends with Tommy Lee Jones doing No Country, but he did a few interviews in the end. Of course, I covered The Passenger, which was his last book. Remember, it was a dual book. It was The Passenger, and there's a companion piece, which is in the voice of the daughter in the book, but I never covered that. And I didn't cover it because I was one of the first people to cover The Passenger. I got the book the day it came out, and we covered it that week. So I didn't cover the second one, but I need to do the companion piece to it. And this is a brief thing about his language, verbiage, and syntax in McCarthy. Make sure you like and share, guys. People out there, beautiful human citizens. Really appreciate you guys. And if you would, it would be great if you choose to do so, if you want to support me at these links right here, because they help me the most. They get right to me. There's no cut. And yeah, that really helps me out a lot. So here, I'm going to put them up here again, just in case. Thank you, of course, to Jason for dropping those links. Really appreciate you. Thank you, everybody who's here tonight. I see Tech Noir Graphics there. That's my friend Mixky. Shouts out to Tech Noir Graphics. Crispy's right there. Kit. I see Darth there. Hey, Darth Moda and I just did an interview on his channel. You want to go check that out? We did an analysis of The Exorcist. We did that, what was that, last night? So go over to his channel. He's right there in the chat. You can go to his YouTube channel after this is over, and you can check out that interview or that analysis. I thought that went really well. I think it's great when people are out there and we're trying to do something. We're trying to create. Of course, you know, I'm doing literary analysis of other people's creations here, but you help fund the operation here, folks, by supporting me so that I can get on with eventually publishing this book of my own, Monarch, and my book of poems, Runes, and then I can get those to you. Runes is finished. Monarch I'm still working on, and then I have the other book, which I've got a new title for, which was subtitled All the President's Kids. But now I have a new title for it, which I'll tell you sometime in the future. And that one's about messed up, preppy rich kids. Totally different from the Monarch book. But you helped me to do that because you helped me to get the time to be able to write and the resources to do that. And that'll be that'll be a completely different level than doing literary analysis, which I enjoy doing. And it's important to talk about these works. You know, All the Pretty Horses is relevant to us because, for one thing, think about why it's relevant right now. Right. It's relevant because you think about the major event that's happening in the same locale, in the same locus as where the book takes place, but it's going the opposite way, if that makes sense. I'm going to use code because you know what I mean. But the crossing is the other way. This one is the reverse. And so that's relevant to us because this is a coming-of-age story, and it's a bildungsroman, and it's about discovering one's soul and what one is supposed to do in the world and how to be a man. And what it means to be stoic. And I think that's important, especially because the opposite way is the norm, and we rarely get the reversal, the reverse stream. I wrote a poem about that, by the way. Remember, I read it in I think I read it when I did the crossing analysis, which was the last. Yeah, that was the last Cormac McCarthy that I did, which was like, I don't know, 7 months ago or something like that. My poem is called Juarez Nequia. And I'll get back to reading that one day if you guys want to hear that again. And I'll put up the words on the screen, or I'll post it in the community tab if anybody cares about seeing that again. But it deals with a speaker crossing the other way into Juarez. So this says about his verbiage and his syntax: the style seems to be the plainest possible in English. The syntax is basic. Sentences almost invariably ordered subject, verb, complement. The boy slid, Rollins pulled, they rode, and so on. In the transparent style, verbs and their arguments stand unmodified in a clear and strong relation to each other. Rarely do introductory or intervening phrases interfere with the clear statement of action. The directness and immediacy of the syntax embodies that of the scene. We find few adjectives, either as preceders of nouns or as complements, and few adverbs formed from adjectives. Most of the adverbial information concerns time and place, rarely manner, across the road, in the dark, prepositional phrases. Both nouns and verbs are usually concrete, morphologically simple, and of Anglo-Saxon derivation: slice, road, shoal, high, etc. The rhythm of these monosyllables, like beating hooves, is often strong and regular. This is the standard style, the unmarked norm of the novel. Remarkably, it's used for the most crucial scenes. We find it not only in scenes of getting dressed and feeding horses, buying food and closing gates, but in scenes central to the plot. The descriptions of the mother's stage performance, the execution of Blevins, the prison murder, the last meeting of John Grady and Alejandra, among others. In these passages, the language appears limited, precise, but powerful. The style honors the action. This is a great example. This is by Nancy Kreml on stylistic variation and cognitive constraint, or essay in this book of Bloom's essays on all the pretty horses. But that's interesting because that is what we've talked about the entire time. Form plus content equals meaning. And the way that the language of the work, the language of the narrative, whether it's prose or verse, has to reflect the action and the style and conform to themes that are inherent within the work's purpose and its meaning, right? In verse, we have something much more wholly cohesive, which is that the best words in the best order, as Samuel Taylor Coleridge said. But this one is different. And McCarthy's prose works, they're all prose, function as a kind of, in a way, they're like a Melvillian prose poem. I mean, Harold Bloom says that Moby Dick is probably the greatest poem in the English, in American poem in the English language. And what he means is that it does serve as the best words in the best order. Although it's prose, it functions as a kind of saga or an epic poem. It's just updated to pre-modernity. This is the standard style, the unmarked norm. This says such undirected interpretation is not found in other style. The narrative voice, the opaque, which is shown all the more opaque by its contrast with the transparent. Because the transparent style is so transparent, so unforegrounded, the appearance of the opaque style suddenly draws the reader's attention to the language and to the significance of McCarthy's stylistic choices. We first learn to recognize its characteristics in extended passages like the remainder of the paragraph describing the departure from Mexico. And that paragraph goes, it's page 30. They rode out on the high prairie where they slowed the horses to a walk, and the stars swarmed around them out of the blackness. They heard somewhere in that tenantless night a bell that tolled had ceased where no bell was. And they rode out on the round dais of the earth, which alone was dark and no light to it, which carried their figures and bore them up into the swimming stars, so that they rode not under but among them, and they rode at once jaunty and circumspect. I read this passage. Like thieves newly loosed in that dark electric, like young thieves in a glowing orchard, loosely jacketed against the cold in 10,000 worlds for the choosing. I read that passage. That was one of the passages that I remarked on. And the reason was, again, because I think this is something they didn't get in any of these essays. But again, that's how the nocturnal and the nightscape, or the landscape in the day, serve to override the the free will of the characters. They seem small in this landscape, and yet they're full of possibility. They're full of will. They're full of potential goodness, right? And the introduction of metaphor, stars swarmed, marks the transition of the riders from the town to the high prairie, and stylistically marks the introduction of the opaque style. And then let's see, anything else in this book that I wanted to point out? We got the mythology of the sacred cowboy in the American mythology, fate versus free will, with Alejandra's old lady. Let's see, what else? And I suppose that's about it. So that's all the pretty horses. So remember that, of course, I've done Blood Meridian, No Country for Old Men, The Passenger, The Road. Don't forget about The Road, which I subtitled Obsidian Pilgrims, and The Crossing. And this is all the pretty horses. So that's my 6th Cormac McCarthy work. Also coming up soon, of course. I don't know if this is going to be the next one. I'm going to do Bret Easton Ellis's The Shards. Got to get back to Bret Easton Ellis. I've done American Psycho, Glamorama, The Outs. What else? Lunar Park, The Informers. I haven't done Less Than Zero, but I probably won't do Less Than Zero. But I've done a bunch of Bret Easton Ellis, and maybe next I will do The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. This is Anne Bronte. I was just talking about Jane Austen. Not that that's a Bronte. It's different, but same sort of universe here. I just was talking about Jane Austen on the last TNT that I did with Hesher last Friday, because they're building a They're thinking of building a statue of Jane Austen. And they're thinking of putting it inside Winchester Cathedral, which I have obvious problems with. But putting a statue inside the cathedral, and also the problem that apparently the Winchester people had in England. Winchester Cathedral is beautiful, and I have two of my best friends are from there, and I've spent a lot of time there. I went to Homeland's Music Festival Tune in 2004, one of the best music festivals I've ever been to. Saw Sasha and Digweed, Paul Oakenfold, a bunch of people there. Fergie, not the Fergie from Black Eyed Peas, but Fergie, the Northern Irish DJ. But anyway, their problem was they don't want a bunch of selfie-taking American tourists there, desecrating the spot, and I can't really blame them. But put a statue of Jane Austen up in Hampshire, right? No, Crispy. So anyway, that's that. Let's see if we got any support here. Shouts out to our friend Jason out there who drops $5 on PayPal. Thank you so much. Hey, shouts out to Jeb out there who dropped $5 and says Alejandra. I don't remember the words of the song. Alejandra. Shouts out to Jeb out there for that $5. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Why did I get something from Netflix? Spoiler: Spaceman ending explained. I don't know what this is. I don't care. I tried to watch Spaceman with what's his name? Adam Sandler, and I could not watch it. Let me know if you've seen that movie. It has nothing to do with our thing tonight, but let's see. Shouts out to Gabe L out there who dropped $30 and wants me to cover. What was it you wanted me to cover? Wants me to cover Welt am Dracht, the full series. And and drop $30. Hey, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to all the members out there getting memberships. Appreciate you out there. If you want to sponsor a stream, please support me on PayPal, Cash App, or Venmo. And please, for a sponsored stream, drop me $100 if you want to see that. I've got a bunch of them coming up. Of course, I've got to do Westworld. I got to do the whole Westworld season coming up. I've also got to do The Trial, Franz Kafka. Shouts out to Tech Noir Graphics out there who drops $10. Really appreciate that, homeboy. Thank you so much. And yes, and it says personalized note. For personalized note, I can't get what's the personalized note? I can't get it. Why is it not doing what? Show me the note. Ah, there you go. Yo, shouts out there. Yo, shouts out there for that. $10 from Tech Noir Graphics. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you, buddy. You are the best. Thank you. Let's see if we got any support over here on Super Chats. Yes. Jason gifted some memberships. Thank you so much. He gifted one membership. Shouts out to Randy West, who dropped $1 on Super Chats. No comment. Shouts out to Rosie McCann. Welcome to High IQ Book Enjoyer. Got a membership. Thank you so much. If I'm missing any, please let me know. And, so a bunch of sponsor streams coming up, bunch of stuff. I watched the movie The Zone of Interest today, which is up for Best Picture. I'm not going to talk about it here if I'm going to do an analysis of it, which is I would only do on the membership channel, on the membership stream. She play us some undertones. Here comes the summer. Shouts out to those boys from Londonderry, the Undertones. Right, crispy. And that weren't they from? Where are they from? They were Northern Irish. I think they were from there. And I think that's about it. So yeah, if you want to see the Zone of Interest, I'm not sure if I can even do an analysis here because of the subject matter. So we got to watch really what we say because of what that's about. Hello. But I did think it was, shouts out to Seraphim Goose out there. Thank you for that membership. Yep, he's a new member. Long time homeboy around here, Seraphim Goose. But if you want to see me do that, let me know. I'm going to see Dune 2. I know Jay and Tristan are going to do a Dune 2 analysis soon. I didn't read much sci-fi or fantasy when I was a kid, and I haven't read the Dune books. I haven't seen Game of Thrones. I haven't read Dune. I've only read 2 of J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, I've read Tolkien's Beowulf translation, and I read Fellowship of the Ring, and I read The Hobbit, but I haven't read the Silmarillion or anything. That's just not my, it's not my area. It's not my area. But I definitely have seen Dune, and I've seen the David Lynch Dune. And people would probably disagree with me on that, but I cannot handle the David Lynch Dune. I saw it when it came out, when I was like 4. On TV, I made the mistake of watching it when I was like 4, so that was not good. But yeah, I need to see. Yeah, Dune 2 is out now. It came out Friday. A lot of people have been sending me DMs about seeing it. And I will read Dune. But I probably would only do a full Dune analysis, literary analysis, with a sponsor stream, just like Thomas Pynchon. I'm not going to read Gravity's Rainbow unless somebody sponsors it. Or I'm not going to do an analysis of it. And I guess that's about it. You guys, if you have any questions or comments, you can drop them at madmaximalism with 2 X's at gmail.com. You can sponsor me on Instagram. Please follow Rooks G. Please follow iPack Arts on Instagram. Shouts out to all of our homeboys. And yeah, I've Joe Dorowski's doing also. I did notice today. I was talking to Jamie about it, about how I was questioning how Elvis plays the Harkonnen baddie in Dune 2, which I haven't seen, but I was questioning about how he looks like Prometheus, right? And then I found an article on how H.R. Giger was, designed both or whatever. But that's for them to cover. They'll cover that. But I just thought it was interesting because I don't know the Dune universe that well. I only know the movies. But I just think it's interesting that the Harkonnens are. Jamie told me that it's because the Harkonnens have a black sun, and so their skin makes them look the way they do. The Dune movie, I didn't, when I first saw Dune, the new Dune with Denis, the Denis Villeneuve movie, I wasn't really that keen on it until somebody I know recommended that I had nothing to do. I think forget what happened, but he recommended that I watch it like one afternoon, just watch that all day. And I actually took his advice and I did. I watched it like 3 times in one day. And I was like, yep, I was wrong about this. This is great. And now I really love it. So sometimes your recommendations from friends can work. And so, I like how, what's his name? Who plays Harkonnen? Who plays the main bad guy? Skarsgård. I liked how Skarsgård is clearly doing a Kurtz Marlon Brando, skull gripping palm coming out of the black goo. It's clearly a nod to Apocalypse Now. And Spice is Spice Drino? Is that what Spice is? Is it Drino? So anyway, that's for another stream, you guys. And I watched. You know what else I watched? Just since we're tying it up here at the end, I did watch another movie that is up for Best Picture this year, and that's The Holdovers, which you may not have seen. It's an Alexander Payne movie, and it's Paul Giamatti. I watched it because, of course, it's about a boarding school. It's about a prep school, and he's a teacher at a prep school who deals with a senior in like 1971 who is. Everybody gets sent home for Christmas. It's the one time in prep school life where everybody goes home. Even in British boarding schools and in elite American boarding schools, they go home. But these are kids who for one reason or another can't go home. They got to stay, and that happens. But it's about it's a coming of age, but also it's a learning experience for this prep school history professor. He's a professor. He's not a professor. He's a prep school teacher, a Greek teacher, and I thought it was great. I actually thought that it wasn't as great as I wanted it to be. Because usually these kinds of Dead Poet Society movies dealing with people who are learning about themselves and learning to be kind can be very heartwarming, right? Especially when it deals with, prep school boys. I was one. So there's a lot for me to latch on to that in the movie, but it didn't have as much as I wanted it to have. And I think maybe that's part of it. It was the understatement of the film. But I would recommend seeing it. It's nice to see something sort of semi-wholesome now in movies. And that's also it's not really an original story. It's been done before, but it is an original movie. And I think it's important to see things that aren't sequels anymore, or that aren't just taking the things that have already been done. I can't wait to see Alex Garland's Civil War, of course. I've covered Alex Garland here. I did the book, The Beach, which was how Alex Garland got started, and the film, The Beach, and I also did his film Men, and I did Devs, which was his TV show. So I've covered quite a lot here. So Crispy's going to pay me a paint at Lavries. Nice, dude. Well, maybe we can go to the parlor, like the old days. We can go to the parlor right down the street from my old house, my old flat. Or we can go to the Egg, if those are still there. I wonder if those are still there in Belfast. I never really went to Lavries. I did. I went a few times, but it wasn't really my joint. But I definitely went to the parlor all the time. And I went to Shine all the time. Went to Shine and Super Shine all the time. I saw Deep Dish there. Who else? Green Velvet. I saw a Brian Jonestown Massacre in the new Students Union right after they renovated it there. Anyway, so that's about it, y'all. I appreciate it. Let's see. Just make sure there's not anything else. You guys, please make sure you like and share. Leave a comment for me afterwards. It helps out a lot. Think about supporting me. If you want to support me, I could really use the support always. And you can mainly support me at those PayPal links. And those are on the video description and the channel description all the way. You can sponsor a stream. You can like and share the stream. You can put this on your social medias and all that stuff. So thanks again for being here with me to cover Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, my 6th Cormac McCarthy analysis. And we're going to have much more and much more deep dive, many more deep dives into high IQ literary analysis. So thank you so much. Hey, there's Jerry. He says, great stream, homeboy. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, Brian Jonestown Massacre are touring again, Bill Hicks. Yeah. I think Anton just got in a fight with one of the band members on stage. So that's pretty interesting. They were great. That's one of the best concerts I've ever been to. It was like 3.5 hours, and it was in the Students Union. I could not believe it. That was when I was there for grad school. I think that was 2006, spring of 2006 when I saw him. Anyway, yes, living the dream. Great job. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I guess that's about it, y'all. So I'm going to leave us with who am I going to leave us with? Who do I always leave us with? Okay. I'm going to drop this link one more time if anybody wants to support me. It's tough out there, folks. Who am I Hey, there's Moon. Shouts out to Moon out there. Yeah, I'm going to leave us with who we always are left with, which is Sting and cut off his new album. All right? Take it away. We do it live. Yeah, Comtrues. No, I like Comtrues. I got Comtrues on CD.